Welcome to Earthkeeper Stargate videos. The following interview with Dr. Lora Little and Dr. Greg Little is quite interesting, covering a variety of truly fascinating topics. Discussion areas include the Edgar Cayce readings regarding Atlantis, the Hall of Records, and the origin and geometry of Native American mounds. James Tyberonn, Earthkeeper, is the interview host. Enjoy. And namaste.
Welcome, everyone. My name is James Tyberonn, and you're listening to Earthkeeper Stargate Audio. I'm very excited today. I've been waiting a long time, in fact, to meet and to interview these two amazing people that have kindly agreed to be a part of our program today. And that is Dr. Lora Little and Dr. Gregory L. Little. Dr. Lora Little is a prolific writer, researcher, and speaker, and she and her husband Greg are two of the world's leading experts on Atlantis and the legendary Atlantean Hall of Records. Lora has been drawn to the extraordinary myths and stories of Atlantis since childhood. She is an honored and certified professional psychotherapist and has pursued ancient mysteries with great passion and brilliant academic focus. She is the author and co-author of numerous brilliantly collated books and articles on the search for Atlantis, as well as the Lost Hall of Records, that the acclaimed psychic Edgar Cayce described in trance readings. Greg Little is a certified doctor of psychology and practicing psychologist. He is now turned explorer, author, speaker, researcher, and respected documentary filmmaker. So we welcome today Dr. Lora Little and Dr. Greg Little. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, James. Thank
you
so much for having us.
No, thank
Hi,
you,
James. And, thank you for that introduction. You read it really well, exactly as we wrote it. Actually, I don't think we wrote that, but that sounds really good.
Well, thank you very much for being here. And as I mentioned, I've been really excited about the two of you coming to our event in Arkansas. And just before we begin, I'd like to mention to everyone that we are sponsoring a 4-day event in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas, my hometown, November 17th through 20th. We have over 500 registered, and we sell out at 625. We have an absolutely stellar lineup of speakers, including Drs. Lora and Greg Little, David Childress, who is the voice of Ancient Aliens, my mentor, John Van Auken, who is the director of the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and we also have the amazing Graham Hancock and Stanton Friedman. So it's going to be a wonderful event. We still have spaces available. If you would be interested in attending, you can register on our website, www.earth-keeper.com. Okay, so Lora, I'd like to bring the first question to you. And basically, I'd like to ask you to share a little bit of information about your work with the Edgar Cayce organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment.
Okay. Well, I've been really privileged to work as a volunteer, first of all, at the local level, as well as in the 10-state Southeast region. And as of 3 years ago, I was asked to serve on the Board of Trustees. It's a 5-year term, so I'm almost ending my term. I discovered the Edgar Cayce material by reading the book There's a River that actually Greg kept telling me I needed to read. And I had so much other stuff going on in school that I thought, no, I can't read anything else for pleasure. But one night he left the book on the bed. He was working nights, I was working days, and he left the book open. He was rereading it, and I thought, I'm going to read something real quick so that I can go to sleep. And that was a big mistake because I was at 2 a.m. still couldn't put the book down. It just was a major consciousness shift for me. I had read about reincarnation, read about paranormal ideas, had read about Atlantis since I was a young person, but had not run into the Cayce story, and it just blew me away. And the next thing I wanted to do was find out what was going on at the ARE, which is the organization that provides access to the Edgar Cayce material, and it's located in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and it was probably a year later that Greg and I made a trek up there to take a look at it, and a couple more years later I went to my first conference. And then about 10 years later got involved in a conference locally that was done by some volunteers in Memphis. We have a really active volunteer group here that does programs with the Edgar Cayce material. And I joined an Edgar Cayce Search for God study group that some of those folks had put together, and I've been in it now for 27 years.
Well, it's an absolutely amazing organization. And in my opinion, the Edgar Cayce Foundation and the Association for Research and Enlightenment is the most important spiritual/metaphysical organization on the planet. Cayce's readings are so credible, and he lived such an impressive life of integrity that played a major role in my joining the ARE and becoming a big supporter of the ARE, because it changed my life. And like your story, Lora, I was actually working as a geologist on the banks of the Amazon River in 1978, and I was the only American on the site. We were actually drilling to map potassium chloride deposit for the Ministry of Minerals in Brazil. And a German man gave me a copy. In fact, he gave me a stack of about 10 books to read while I was on the job site. Most of the books he gave me were Lewis L'Amour Westerns, which were pretty popular in those days on work locations. But one of the books was There Is a River. And I read it from cover to cover, and it changed my life. So I'm with you on the amazing influence of that book. So thank you for sharing that. I would also like to mention briefly that at our event in Arkansas, we are going to conduct a membership drive for the ARE. We will be speaking about the benefits of the memberships. We'll also have drawings for those that join. We will be offering a genuine 5-ogle crystal in the drawings. So we are hoping to get a lot of sign-ups and sign-up renewals for the ARE. And so, Greg, I'd like you to just share a little bit about the work that you do in Memphis professionally, and the work that you have done regarding Atlantis, and your fascinating new book on Native American mounds.
Well, what I do professionally, I actually specialize in criminal treatment, and I've done that since the 1970s, and starting in the middle 1980s, along with some other people, we developed some treatment programs, cognitive behavioral programs that have since expanded, and we're in 9 different countries, all 50 states, and we've probably had roughly 3 million inmates and offenders go through our programs around the world. And now it's about 300,000 to 400,000 a year go through it. But basically that's what I do professionally. I write treatment workbooks, and then I also write a lot of books in archaeology and mounds and generate a lot of articles. And Lora and I got into this exploration back around 2001, I believe. And really it wasn't, the interest in the exploration started with a fellow I know you had last year at a conference, Andrew Collins. And it was a follow-up to 1970s work that was done by some ARE members to try and find some things in the Bahamas. And initially, we never really intended to get into this Atlantis research per se. We were looking for some very specific things. But as fate often has it, we got sort of drawn into this search for Atlantis project, which all in all, I'll let Lora describe most of that, but we made 25 separate trips into the Bahamas, also into Guatemala, looking for Cayce's Hall of Records that I know you'll talk about in a few minutes. But I'm also very interested in Native American Indian mounds, Native American rituals, the crystals. I'm definitely interested in that and would love to talk about crystals and earth and so on and what Native Americans believed. But that's kind of a sort of a summary. I've written a whole lot of material and a lot of books.
Well, you are both certainly Renaissance people, multi-talented, multitasking. I imagine your hours are numbered every day with so much to do, and I really want to honor you for the body of work that you have both done, both with the ARE and in your professional lives. It truly is impressive. And Lora,
one other thing, you do an amazing job too. What you put together is absolutely amazing. These seminars and weekend-long workshops you do are just amazing. And I have heard from people that have been to them, and they are just overwhelmed with all the information and the people that they get to meet. So I would encourage anybody out there listening or anybody that listens in the future, go to one of this man's workshops. It's incredible what you do.
Well, thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate that. I'm touched. Thank you so very much. And our goal at Earthkeeper has always been to combine the spiritual with the scientific. And, you know, so often the spiritual omits the scientific and the scientific omits the divine. And so by bringing those two into a full circle, we feel like we're completing the goals in a sense, or the intents in a sense, that Edgar Cayce put forward in his 14,000 readings about the true nature of reality and the combination of the sacred scientific with the divine. And so it's really been our mission to bring in people to these events that are alternative history researchers, such as Graham Hancock and David Hatcher Childress, as well as John Van Auken and all of the others from the ARE. We were very blessed to have Charles Thomas Cayce speak at our event in Colorado a couple of years ago. And just an amazing group, the ARE. And as I have mentioned, the ARE is, in my opinion, the most credible spiritual metaphysical organization on the planet. And it really is modern. It is, there is incredible scientific data. Greg, I've heard your interviews that you have done on the internet, ones with George Norrie and others, and you have spoken quite a bit about the life of Edgar Cayce, and you had information that I wasn't familiar with. And so I applaud the two of you, Lora and Greg, for the work that you do with the ARE as well. So, Lora, would you tell us a little bit about the Hall of Records?
Okay. The Cayce material gives an incredibly detailed story about Atlantis that you won't get anywhere else. And one of the most fascinating things is what he talked about as Hall of Records, and these are records that the Atlanteans left behind. Now, lots of people, including Plato, have written about Atlantis, but oftentimes the clues that they give us are hard to follow up on. In Cayce's particular body of information. What's really exciting is that the Hall of Records are something we can follow up on. He gives us quite a bit of detailed information. And, for example, he says that there were 3 sets of records, and there's one near the right paw of the Sphinx, and we assume underground. There's one somewhere in the Yucatan, and it very likely could be near the classic Mayan site of Piedras Negras, Guatemala. And the third one, he says, is in the area of Bimini, under the sea, under the slime of the Sea of Ages. So it's probably covered by coral, which would be expected. But he also says that portions of it would rise again in 67 or 68 and 69. So some people think it could be near Bimini in the Bahamas, where the Bimini Road was discovered. We've actually spent most of our time working with the Guatemala site and Bimini more than anything in the Bahamas. We've done surveys of the Great Bahama Bank. We've done a lot of analysis around Bimini and around Andros. There's a almost duplicate set of stones to the Bimini Road near Andros that we named the Andros platform, that we sort of found by accident, thanks to a salvager and a dive operator in the area. We've done aerial surveys of the Great Bahama Bank, looking for anything that might be a sign of a building, underwater building. One of the things that the Cayce readings is real specific about is that there were 3 major destructions of Atlantis, and he gives one of them in 50,000 BC, another one in anywhere from 22 to 28,000. He's a little bit uncertain between those 2 dates. And the final one was around 10,000 BC, which is, of course, 12,000 years ago. And so this thing we're looking for is going to be very, very, very old, and it's more than likely going to be underwater. If you look at the Great Bahama Bank and the Bimini Islands around Nassau and Freeport and Andros, if you look at them on Google Earth, you can see that the Great Bahama Bank is fairly shallow. It's only about 15 feet deep. And in 10,000 BC, it would have all been above water.
Wow.
So we're interested to see if we can find any building remains on the Great Bahama Bank. And we spent several years and several of our expeditions doing flyovers, getting GPS, and then chartering boats and going from site to site, trying to locate and then dive on each of those sites.
Well, as we speak, 2 dear friends of ours, Mary Pat and Fred Fuchs, who you may have met, are actually in Malta. They're tuning in to this interview to listen to you tonight. And Fred Fuchs is putting together a documentary about Atlantis. From the best that I can surmise, and I'd like your opinion, were Egypt, Greece, and the areas in the Mediterranean colonies of Atlantis or part of Atlantis?
Well, here's the interesting thing that a lot of people don't get to in the Cayce readings. Even as far back as 50,000 BC, when they described the destruction that occurred at that time, it occurred because they were trying to rid the earth of some sort of large animals that were causing problems. And they got together a group of leaders from multiple countries, China, India, South America. There were already civilizations other than Atlantis. They got together, they discussed things, they made a plan, and of course they made a mistake in how they tried to go about getting rid of these animals, and it created some sort of catastrophe that broke up the whatever continent was of Atlantis into smaller islands, and that happened again in 28,000 BC. So I would say what we find from the Cayce life readings is that there were people in Egypt from Atlantis. That, in fact, he says that at least the planning of the building of the Great Pyramid was done by Atlanteans because they were the expert builders. That was one of their specialties. They had that particular knowledge. So to say that Atlantis was the only thing there is not true. There are other there were other civilizations. Now, he talks about migrations of Atlanteans in all three of those destructions. A great deal of them went to South America, which is extremely interesting. As Greg may discuss, we're beginning to find some of the oldest mounds and some of the oldest settlements now, pyramids and so forth, in South America. And that would certainly fit with Cayce's migration stories. So, yes, they were probably in Greece. They certainly were in the Pyrenees. They were, and there's some feeling that probably the fact that the Basque language is so different from the Indo-European languages that it very well could have had some roots in something from Atlantis. He also identifies the Somerset area of England, which is the area where Stonehenge is. They don't date Stonehenge back as far as 10,000 BC, but they're beginning to move some of those dates back. So what you get in Cayce's story is a very active world. You get cultures that had reached a much higher level of civilization than we give them credit for. You know, we like to think that we're the peak of civilization, but it looks like it's more like peaks and valleys over hundreds of thousands of years, actually, in the Cayce story. So there were people in China, there were people in India, there were people in South America, in some parts of North America, in Europe, and in the Middle East, and also Africa. He talks about Morocco and some of those areas. So there's just a lot more we don't have scientific evidence for yet.
The work that you and Greg have done toward exploring locations for the Hall of Records is really, truly fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak in Arkansas. Are there Cayce readings about what can be found in these three Halls of Records, and are all three containing the same material or different variations and different timelines? What can we surmise from the Cayce readings is to be found in the Hall of Records?
Well, he gives a fairly long list, and it's not really clear if they're all three going to be exactly the same. But the most interesting thing to be found in all three is a set of 32 tablets. And he's very specific that they're carved in a particular language. And he even says that it's probably going to take a while for the people who find them to be able to translate the language. And it may be that there'll be something found in Egypt, for example, that helps relate, just like the Rosetta Stone helped relate Egyptian hieroglyphs. But at first they won't know what it is. But that will contain the history of Atlantis.
These 32 tablets are made out of stone, engraved in stone?
That's the way he describes it, yes. He also says there are mummies, there are some of their artifacts from the time, musical instruments, food, linens, silks, different things that from their time. Now, whether those things will survive, we don't know, because we don't know exactly how these were put together. But the stone tablets, of course, would be something that would be able to last. So that's what everybody's hoping for.
Well, Greg mentioned earlier an interest in crystals, and as a geologist and as a native of Arkansas, I grew up around crystals. And a lot of the crystal mines in Arkansas back in the 70s, when I was spending a lot of time in the Hot Springs area, were actually selling part of the crystals to be used in the computer industry. You know, quartz is silicon dioxide, and, you know, we think of Silicon Valley and the chips that are being made. And I wonder, and it's interesting that Cayce refers to the great Tuaui stone as a stone. And in several of his readings, he refers to crystals as stones. And I was wondering if the Atlanteans have, as I believe, this highly advanced technology, might it also be possible that they would record some of these records on a silicone chip of some sort, perhaps even a crystal?
Certainly. certainly could be. It's not particularly laid out in the Cayce readings that that's the
Yeah.
case, but who knows what might be if they are stones, and if they were to be crystal stones, there might be more involved than just what's carved on them, and maybe the time will be right. That's one of the things that the readings are real clear about, that these halls of records will not be opened until the time is right in man's evolution. So maybe we have to evolve to the point where we even understand that a crystal might have more information in it, or a stone might have more information in it than what's carved on the outside.
And at the time Cayce made his readings, no one would have understood that information could be encoded in crystalline structure. Nobody would have understood that at the time. And what you're saying there, James, is probably, it's very intriguing and it's very interesting. Crystals, of course, hold tremendous amounts of energy in them. Native Americans held them in very high regard because they were considered the most condensed form of spirit possible.
Wow.
Earth was the most primordial, but the crystals were the most condensed form. And, of course, they used them in rituals. Even shaman used them very often. I may try to demonstrate one of the uses at your conference if we can get all the lights out. But I'm not sure you'll be able to get the emergency lights out. But I think that's a really interesting idea, that they could have encoded a lot of information in crystal structure.
You know, recently, like 2 years ago, Hewlett-Packard came out with what they called the super memory chip, and they took quartz and modified it slightly. And the publication that was released stated that this super quartz had the ability to store this incredible amount of data, just an enormous amount of data. They said it can take the entire history of the world and everything and store it in this one chip, and that this chip would outlast humanity, that these chips could retain that data for over 1 million years, according to the article. So that,
yeah, I'm familiar with that. I kept up with that when it came out, and it was actually amazing. And of course, the development of the cloud, which is misunderstood by a lot of people, but the development of that kind of put this keeping everything at home, say, on a crystalline sort of hard drive, kind of fell by the wayside with the cloud. But of course, the cloud is also a way where someone else controls all your information.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly fascinating. And, you know, I was curious when the crystal skull phenomenon was coming out pre-2012, the idea of the Atlantean 13 skulls. And I had the opportunity to meet Joanne Parks and Michelle Nocerino, and Michelle is the daughter of the father of the Crystal Skull movement, Nick Nocerino. And I wondered if perhaps the idea of the crystal skulls, and I had a discussion with John Van Auken about this, if these were perhaps computers, if these were capable of projecting images, projecting data. And it's fascinating. I've had some very interesting experiences with both Max and Shanaran. Certainly, quartz with all the attributes of piezoelectricity, piezoluminescence. Quartz is an incredible mineral, and it does store data. It does transmit and project, and so it would be an interesting possibility if some of these ancient crystal skulls are actually programmed computers.
It's a possibility. I mean, it is. It's an interesting possibility. I don't think Cayce mentioned the crystal skulls. I think Lora would know more about that than I do, but I don't think he ever talked about them.
No, not to my knowledge. But he, did talk a lot about the Firestone or the Towie stone.
Right.
He used both terms for it, and it was a powerful stone. It was used as a, initially as a way to communicate with the angels, to stay in touch with their spiritual source.
And that's a fascinating idea. I mean, the idea that crystals can be used to, I think he said, communicate with the infinite. And that's a intriguing idea. and something that I'd like to speak a little bit about in Arkansas as well with crystals. And I'd like to show you some of these 5 Vogel crystals that I work with. They're really, really interesting. And Dr. Marcel Vogel developed those. He passed away a few years ago, but he was the leading inventor at IBM for a number of years, and he developed the liquid screen. But he was a fascinating crystallogist as well, and did a lot of work with phi crystals for healing and for work with plants. And he actually was the first one to speak about structured water. It was not Dr. Komoto. Is it Komoto, the doctor, the Japanese doctor that would program water? And but Vogel was actually the first one to do that. So the two of you made a fascinating trip to Guatemala, and I watched your video, and my gosh, that was quite a trek. And you had to deal with the heat, the mosquitoes, the lack of fresh water. How many trips did you make to Guatemala, to Piedras Negras?
Just one.
And that was enough.
It was enough. Actually, I felt like I was in heaven because I had studied the field notes from the 1930s that University of Pennsylvania, which is actually referenced in the Cayce readings, and looked through every artifact. I didn't get to see the artifacts themselves, but all of the reports about the artifacts, what they had handwritten. I had the penciled copies and had to wear the little gloves and all, and just poured over all of it. So by the time we got to the site, I knew the names of the various areas, and it was like seeing something that you had traveled to in your head, and to get to see it on land was just absolutely amazing and wonderful. One of the issues with Guatemala is that this particular site is on the Usumacinta River in Guatemala, which is a border between Mexico and Guatemala. And we saw it as we were there. Every day there was a boatload of people at the same time, or several boatloads going by, up and back. It'd go one way and it'd be full of people. It'd come back the other way and it'd be empty.
Yeah.
Most of the people had backpacks, and most of them were young men. And we suddenly realized this was the immigration issue. This is the early 2000s.
Right.
But there's also a lot of drug smuggling that goes through there. And my understanding is that it's got to be less and less safe area. It wasn't safe when we went, but they did have guards that escorted you around the site. So it's a really, not only a dangerous place, but it's kind of hard to actually dig and find anything, also because you need to have archaeological credentials to really do any kind of digging. But what was most fascinating to us while we were there, the place, of course, is just hot as it can be, and you feel like you're in a sauna the whole time you're there. And what's funny is that they had sweat baths all over the place. That's one of the things the classic Mayan site is known for. They had so many of those, and I'm thinking, why in the world do they need them? it's that way already. Well, but one of the guards showed us where the last archaeological folks had been digging under one of the pyramids, and there was rubble had fallen, and they couldn't really tunnel under it completely, and they said put your hand in there where the little opening was, and when you put your hand in, nothing but cold air.
Wow.
So you knew that there was some kind of cavern under there, just as the archaeologists knew as well. So that's probably one of those areas is probably the location of the Hall of Records, but how to get to it, if even the archaeologists are having trouble,
fascinating.
Is an issue. So
I actually had the opportunity to spend some time with the head of the 84 Mayan nations, and his name was Don Alejandro. And I met him actually in Peru at an Eagle and Condor conference about 10 years ago. And I lived in South America 9 years, so I speak Spanish and Portuguese. And I was able to have some fascinating conversations with him. In fact, he actually gave me a reading, an amazing man, but he told me that his parents had access to caves in Guatemala in which they encountered an ancient race of people who he said had bluish green skin. So that's it's an interesting area, and
I want to say two things about our trip to Piedras Negras. Number one, we had to sleep in what was essentially a pup tent that was put on a sandy bank of the Usumacinta River, and if you walked out of the pup tent and looked around on the banks of the river, there are these huge stones, and there are freshwater crocodiles there. So we could see them, and you wonder about that while you're there. It's like, what in the world? There are so many other things I could say about it. I actually got dehydrated there, and within, it was, I believe, 6 weeks after we left, it made international news that a group of drug runners had taken over Piedras Negras and actually installed machine guns in some of the temples at the top of the hill.
Wow.
That they had taken it over. Now, the military went in and they had several battles, and the people who took us in sent me an email and told me that they had driven off the drug runners. But that's also the main portal for cocaine to move into the States. Wow.
Yeah, it's a shame. I would really love to take a tour group into Mexico, and I've been looking for an opening for the past few years to visit a lot of the pyramids along the Yucatan, and with the danger that's there now, I just don't think it's the right time. But it's a shame because it's a fascinating area. And before, years ago, I did make trips there and went to Chichen Itza and Palenque, and they're absolutely amazing places.
Palenque is only about 30 miles away from Piedras Negras, but it might as well be 1,000 miles.
Yeah, absolutely. And Laura, did you say that there were sweat lodges, that there were sauna
sweat baths, they called them, and they found them all through the classic Maya era in a lot of the sites, but apparently Piedras Negras had an unusually large number of them, and some that are really well preserved, but they seem to have an unusual number of them.
Were these igloo-shaped?
No, they're not. They're square buildings, but they're fairly small, and that they could tell there was a place where they had the fire and it brought the water in, and they were doing steam baths, and very likely could have been for ceremonial purposes too. I don't think they understand the full use of it. They certainly didn't need to do it because they didn't already have plenty of reasons to sweat. It's a very humid area. So
well, these sweat lodges, are called purification ceremonies or inipis in the Native Americans, and I've done quite a few sweat lodges. Right. And some of the ones, I actually did a 5-day vision quest in Mexico on a Yaqui reservation a few years ago, and they actually completed with a sweat lodge. But some of the ones that they had as part of their ceremony throughout Mexico, in fact, not just the Yaqui, but the Toltecs and some of the others, are built like igloos. And whereas, the Native Americans use skins and tarpaulins, etc. But, I've been a really focused user of saunas for 40 years. I've probably had a sauna bath, a dry sauna, every day of my life in the last 40 years. I have one in my home. And doing sweat lodges it's a really powerful experience. It can give you a altered state of consciousness, and of course, you sweat out all the impurities. So it's quite an interesting spiritual experience in that way.
And very likely you're right, because if you look at the Mayan iconography, they obviously did a lot of hallucinatory ceremonies. You can see it in the drawings and what we know of the hieroglyphs, what's been told to us. And one of the interesting things about Piedras Negras, the classic Maya site, what you see with the temples and what's still remaining isn't any older than maybe 500 BC. So it's obviously not what would have been there when the Atlanteans were there. But and the name Piedras Negras just means black rocks, and that's where some of the rocks there are darker in color than in other places. But the original Mayan name for the site is really intriguing. It's Yokibi, which means entrance. And so you wonder, what's it an entrance to?
Yeah.
Because it's just one of many classic Mayan sites along the river. There's nothing geographically that you could say this is an entrance to a particular area or a change of some sort. They do have, it is the location of the largest cenote in all of the Yucatan. And we threw rocks down in the cenote while we were there, but it's one of the deepest. And there have been some researchers, Mayan researchers, who have discovered that most of these classic Maya sites have caves underneath them. They were built on caves, or they tunneled underneath. And sometimes, well, the theory is that the priests could then move from one pyramid to another without the people seeing them and do their ceremonies and maybe look more magical. But it also may be that those were sacred sites, because we also know that as each era switched over, that they built pyramids always on top of previous pyramids, that was sacred ground, or they wouldn't build the pyramid there. So, what was the original sacred ground? Was it possibly these underground tunnels? And maybe that's what where the word entrance gets to, and maybe it's an entrance to the Hall of Records. Don't know that, but it makes you wonder.
Well, it opens the idea and the curiosities about the underground Earth theories, about the underground tunnels. And I recently, earlier this year, did a ARE conference in Pennsylvania where I spoke about Atlantis. And when I was researching that, I came across an interesting Cayce reading where he talked about someone who had been one of the keepers of the elevator systems that went into the underground. And so that was the first, and I've got that reading referenced, but that was one of the first and perhaps the only reference he made to, the underground regions of the earth being inhabited and occupied. And I was recently in Peru, in Cusco, which is the capital of the Inca Empire, the ancient Inca Empire, and also, theorized to have been there long before the Incas with the Waris and the other groups. But there is a great legend of underground tunnels in Cusco with some sites that actually have been explored. And there are ideas that this connects into other parts of the world. And certainly you have that classic limestone formation like you have in the Yucatan that does, dissolve and create these underground rivers and streams and cenotes. But it's a fascinating concept, the idea of inner earth and tunnels, et cetera. And Cayce does seem to indicate that the Atlanteans did have the technology to tunnel underground and stored some of the energy masses with gases, which was probably would have been in salt domes, but also as a power source, the compression of gases.
Well, he certainly identifies them as great builders. That they were the experts with any sort of building technology, so that certainly would fit. And then if you consider the most recent, I guess a week ago, on Ancient Aliens, they highlighted similar underground rooms and complexes in Turkey. And
I saw that. I saw that program just a few nights ago. And that's an excellent series, by the way. I love watching that. So, Greg, you have relatively recently, come up with some fascinating information in the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Native American Indian Mounds and Earthworks. Before that, both you and Lora worked with John Van Auken on the Book of Mound Builders. And Greg, your book, Path of Souls, is absolutely fascinating as well. How did you get interested in the Native American mounds and cultures? Was it through Cayce?
No. It was through a series of dreams. That's really the truth. I had finished what I'll call my first book it was around 1983 when I had finished it. And, of course, back in those days, you would mail manuscripts off and you'd wait for publishers to answer. So in the interim, while I was awaiting publication of that first book. I had a series of dreams for, as best as I recall it, roughly 10 nights in a row. And Lora was involved in all this too, but in essence, in my dreams, and these came out of literally nowhere, I was standing on an Indian mound and I took a picture in the dream. This is in the dream. I'm on a mound and I take a picture. And then I'm on another mound and I take another picture. And I'm on another mound and I take a picture. And this went on all night long, night after night after night, for roughly 10 nights in a row. And it was strange because, and this is an accurate statement, everything I knew about Indian mounds written on the back of a postage stamp. I don't know if any of your listeners know what a postage stamp is, but it's a very, very small piece of paper, and I didn't know anything. Nothing was taught about Indian mounds in history. Very little history of anything Native American was taught. I don't really recall anything in high school or in college, or even taking anthropology, anything on it. So this came out of nowhere, and Lora and I had I'll simply call it sort of a vision of a spider, and we went to a mound site in Memphis and saw this spider, and I suddenly knew what I needed to do was to go to every possible Indian mound site and try to document what was left of them, take a picture of them, write down the details, and so on. So that started in 1983 approximately, which was insane because I had no idea how many there were. I had no idea of the history or how much work it was going to be, and it's been a project that has gone on since then. We've taken every real opportunity we could to go to every site, wherever we were, wherever we traveled, and we did a lot of traveling for about a 10-year period, virtually every week. So we accumulated thousands and thousands of photographs and went to literally thousands of sites. That encyclopedia you mentioned, the new version of it, the 2016 version, the second edition, has roughly 3,000 mound sites in it. But that was the project. There were probably 1 million mounds at one time. There's probably 100,000 of them existing today, and most people simply think of them as small conical heaps of earth that have a burial in them. And that's true in some cases, but that's not the whole story. And that got me into wondering what in the world were these people doing with some of the mound sites, particularly the geometric earthworks, and that led into the Path of Souls idea and the astronomical links to it and what they believed. And actually what they believed really coincides with a lot of what Cayce said and what some other, I will say, psychics or spiritualists have said, and it's remarkable material. I hope to present the whole idea at some point, at least at your conference.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah, very good.
Now, where can people purchase your book? What is your website?
The website is apmagazine.info. But they can go to Amazon and put my name in, and they'll see a lot of things pop up there, including some of the books in psychology and pharmacology and counseling and so on. But apmagazine.info, but I'd recommend them to just go to Amazon and put in Path of Souls or Indian Mounds or whatever, and it'll show up if they're interested.
In your books and in your interviews, you have spoken about some of the lunar alignments, the lunar calendars in certain of these mounds, and octagonal geometries. Can you speak a little bit more about?
Sure. That's the area of archaeo-astronomy, and for many, many years, archaeo-astronomy was considered a taboo topic in mainstream archaeology. In fact, mainstream archaeologists thought it was absurd. And where we're going to be in Arkansas, some of the first archaeo-astronomical studies were done near Arkansas at a site there called Toltec. And the archaeologists that tried to evaluate Toltec actually said there were two problems. Number one, they could do alignments from mound to mound, and we're not talking about small mounds here. We're talking about very large formations of earth and earthworks, which are linear formations of earth that are formed into various shapes and geometric patterns. But what the archaeologists said in the 70s and 80s is, we don't know what time of year to look, because if you actually watch from one mound over another, night after night after night, you'll see all sorts of stars and movements there. So they didn't know when to look, and they didn't know what time of year to look. They didn't know what time of night or to look. So about all archaeologists accepted until the mid-'80s was that mounds would show alignments to the sun on the solstices and the equinox. It would show like the winter solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, summer solstice sunrise and sunset. But other than that, they said there's just too many possibilities here. We don't know what to look for. And in the mid-1980s, a couple of professors in Ohio went to a site called Newark, the Newark Earthworks, which is the most incredible archaeological geometric earthworks anywhere in the world. I'll say that again. America, in Ohio, has the most amazing, largest set of earthworks in the world of anywhere. They were built roughly around the year 500 BC, or 2,500 years ago. And they actually have earthworks that extend 56 miles to Chillicothe, Ohio, from Newark, to an almost identical set of the same thing. And what it is, there are these earthen walls that form circles, outer circles that are roughly 15 feet high, forming a perfect circle that generally enclose 30 to 50 acres. Then it connects to an octagon that encloses 50 acres. Inside the octagon, which has 8 points to it, there is a truncated pyramid, an earthen truncated pyramid. And what these archaeologists did was they calculated in the 1980s, at a time when it was very difficult to do this kind of work, that structure was used to calculate the moon's 18.61-year cycle. Wow. And by knowing that, you could predict exactly when eclipses would occur. So it was an eclipse calculator. They then followed this 56-mile-long earthwork, which was actually 2 parallel walls of earth forming what was basically an interstate highway. They're about that wide. So you had these walls of earth on the outside and a flat walkway in the center going 56 miles to an identical set of a circle and octagon, and it calculated the exact same thing but at a different time of the year. So that's how it all started. Now, with new information, which archaeologists actually came out with in the mid-2000s, they finally figured out what's been known a long time, but they just never looked. That's a long, involved story. But the Native American mound builders, at least, believed that there was this ritual, a death ritual, that the soul of the deceased had to make a leap to the stars and then follow a pathway to another star where there was a portal out of the sky world. So the spiritual life force, which they called the free soul, would make this leap, and it went to Orion's Nebula, which is the 3 belt stars of Orion, and then right below it is kind of a fuzzy bluish-red area, and that is a nebula. And they believed that was what they called an OGEE, O-G-E-E, and it's a slit in the sky. So they jumped to that, and then it went down. They had to jump at a certain time in the morning, only in the winter, very complicated, but this is the belief. And then it went under the earth and came up the next night on the other side, on the eastern horizon. And then they would follow the Milky Way, which was called the Path of Souls. The stars on the Milky Way are the souls making the journey. They went to the north to the constellation of Cygnus, which was on that show Ancient Aliens last week. And they met this gigantic bird, which was a judge, and if they passed a test, they were allowed to go through another OGEE out of the sky world to the land of the ancestors. That's kind of a summary of all that.
That is absolutely
really
fascinating. Yeah. You speak I believe it's in Path of Souls, about the symbols of the eye and the hand. That has, does that tie into this journey as well?
Yes. The eye and the hand, if you look in old archaeology books, they'll tell you it's a symbol that was found First at Moundville, Alabama in the 1800s. Initially, when the archaeologists got a hold of it, they thought it was a fake. But then they started finding more, and now there's around 200 examples of it that have been pulled from mounds. And it looks like the palm of a hand, and in the middle of the palm of the hand, there's what looks like an eye, but it's not really an eye, it's a slit. The hand is Orion's Nebula. It's the hand constellation. The hand would be pointing down, dangling from the sky. The three belt stars of Orion form the wrist of this severed hand, and they had a story about how the hand got hung in the sky, and it was hung there as really as an example to others who might try to block that portal. But anyway, that is that symbol. There's also the symbol of this feathered serpent, which is, people have talked about it being Quetzalcoatl well, Quetzalcoatl was in Peru and also in some of the Mexican beliefs. I call Mexican, and the Aztecs.
Right.
Feathered serpent. But the feathered serpent of Native Americans, and probably also that in Central America, was the constellation of Scorpius, which Scorpius was the ruler of the underworld. All of this was worked out by a group of around 40 anthropologists and archaeologists. They put out a series of books and reports on it starting in the late 90s, about 2005. I actually spoke to one of the head people a couple of weeks ago as I was working on a follow-up book to some of this with Andrew Collins. And the material where they got this from, it's interesting. It's been in libraries. It's been in libraries since the 1800s. It's just it hadn't been digitized. And in our modern age, you get people that the only research they want to do is look it up on the Internet. They wouldn't go into the libraries and pull these books that some of them have 2,000 pages and actually do the work. But they did it. And that's how all this was uncovered. They then took it to many of the tribal leaders, to modern tribes who basically verified it. Some of them, it's sacred knowledge. They really didn't want it to get out. But the information's known now.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, does Arcturus come into play in this?
Arcturus is a really interesting thing in this, and I've talked to John about this recently. John and I have talked, John Van Auken, we've talked about doing an article on this. Arcturus, of course, was mentioned by Cayce, and it's a portal. And Arcturus, most people don't know this, but Arcturus is not really a native of the Milky Way. It, and along with about 30 other stars that Arcturus is dragging with it, actually moves through our Milky Way back and forth in a long, long cycle. And Arcturus is not meant. Now, Native Americans didn't use the same names for stars that we did, nor did they use the same names of the constellations. Obviously, there was a hand constellation, and there's a feathered serpent, and there was the eagle, which was the Cygnus constellation. The Pleiades was important to them. But I have seen some things that have mentioned Arcturus, but Cayce talked about it as being a portal that souls move back and forth into this galaxy on, and it's interesting. I'm being hesitant in giving out the information on it because the fact that it's not actually it's moving through the Milky Way, but it oscillates back and forth through the Milky Way, literally cutting a vertical. It's like a vertical cut through the horizontal Milky Way. It's astounding.
It's absolutely fascinating, and you know, with the work that you're doing, I can see the correlations between some of the Egyptian cosmology, the Hall of Maat, and you were talking about a sort of judgment that would occur in the path of souls. And
yeah,
so
it is an almost identical belief system. It makes you wonder, why did all these people have an identical belief system? And we know the Egyptians believed in Orion. And if you believe in Andrew Collins' work, which I do, they also saw Cygnus as very important.
Absolutely. Andrew gave a absolutely fascinating presentation about Göbekli Tepe and the Swan, and he's a an absolutely remarkable researcher. And I see that he has written the foreword to Path of Souls.
Yeah, he wrote a really extensive foreword and an afterword, and that is the basis of a book that we're working on together right now, which is a follow-up to his newest one about Göbekli Tepe, and then the Path of Souls, where we're combining it. And we're trying to trace the tall ones, I'll call them, the large skeletons that the Smithsonian pulled out of Adena-era mounds in America, and trying to trace their genetic lineage, which I know we haven't talked about genetics any. At your conference on the first day that Lora and I talked, she's going to give an overview of what Cayce said about Atlantis and what happened and where they went, and then I'm going to give an overview of the genetics, because there's some real strong evidence that what Cayce said is true, and we probably know what Atlantean DNA was or is. It still exists.
That's fascinating. And in one of your interviews, Greg, you talk about 8-foot skeletons being found in portions of Missouri and Arkansas.
Yeah.
And Cayce spoke about Atlanteans being, I think it was 12 feet tall and well proportioned.
He did have, I think there's 5 readings that talk about giants in the past and very tall, large people. The Smithsonian actually pulled 17 7 to 8 foot tall skeletons out of mounds in the 1800s. And then various archaeologists have pulled out 7 and 8 footers from American mounds. And that's something that archaeologists just despise. They just hate that information. They don't deny that, but they deny anybody above 8 feet has ever been found. And I can't find in any of in the actual archaeological reports where they found somebody above 8 feet tall. But there's far too many of these 7 and 8 foot skeletons that they found in really fabulous tombs at the base of mounds, in sub-mound tombs. And they were clearly the elite, the shaman and the priests, perhaps the chiefs, but I would say most of them are the shaman. And there's far too many of them statistically. We actually did a statistical study of them. And archaeologists have looked at that statistical report, and they said, okay, this is the Adena elite hypothesis, that during the Adena period, the shaman were all exceptionally tall people. So the question is, where did these people come from? And where did they get their beliefs?
Absolutely. Well, we're coming toward the end of our hour, and if we can just take a few more minutes, I'd like to open it up, and we can take perhaps 2 or 3 questions from we have over 500 people listening by web and a couple of hundred by phone. And so if anyone would like to pose a question, you have a tab to do that. And I do have one question that's come through now, and it's for Lora. The question is, was there a recent discovery in Giza that indicated the Hall of Record that came up in a recent sonar confirmation?
My understanding from John Van Auken is that there has been a sort of an X-ray process used, but on the Great Pyramid, not on the Sphinx. If something has occurred around the Sphinx, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, Robert Schoch was speaking not too long ago that they were doing sonar around the Sphinx, and that there is a room down there that they think could be the Hall of Records. And this is fairly recent. This was an interview that Robert was doing maybe 6 months ago. And it's really a shame that we can't get down there, and there's so much happening, I suppose, in Egypt that makes it politically precarious right now.
It really does. I would suggest the questioner might be interested in Andrew Collins' book, Beneath the Pyramid, because he talks about the caves under the Giza Plateau that start at the Temple of the Birds and move toward the Sphinx. And there's some push to try to get that completely not excavated, but explored, and it leads directly to the right paw of the Sphinx. So chances are it's all part of the same thing. We're getting closer and closer.
And to realize that Cayce spoke of this so many years ago is absolutely fascinating. So we'll take one more question, and this one is for Greg. And Greg, this is John in Maryland, and he is asking, what do you think is the single most impressive mound in North America?
Well, the most impressive mound would be the largest in terms of impressive. That's in Cahokia, Illinois, which is across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. It is 100 feet tall, which is a 10-story building, and it has a base of 14 acres, which is 1 acre larger than the Great Pyramid. There were 120 mounds at the site. There is a huge stone structure inside of it that was discovered in the 90s, but no work has been done there. No work will be done there on it because of laws. So that's clearly the most impressive mound. But if the person, he's in Maryland, he needs to hop over to Newark, Ohio, and go to Mound Builders Golf Course. Seriously, it's Mound Builders Golf Course in Newark, Ohio.
Well, that is, that's fascinating.
And that's why it's so impressive. It is one of the few geometric earthworks in America that's been perfectly preserved, and it's because it's been a golf course and it's pristine. And the golf course can't do any work on it other than keep it maintained.
And James, we've taken tours for ARE to that particular site, and Greg even gives an overview of it the night before we're going to go see the site. And nobody is ever prepared for the immensity of it. And
do you have one planned for this year or next year?
Not so far. We've done some.
Okay.
We probably will in the next couple of years, but we don't have a plan at the moment.
Well, that would be absolutely fascinating. So I want to thank the two of you sincerely for giving us your time and expertise and wisdom. You're both amazing people. I'm sincerely really looking forward to meeting you both. We hope that you'll have books available. We'll do a book signing, and just a brilliant amount of work that you two have done, and I want to really honor you. I feel a connection to you both, that spiritual family thing that Cayce talks about, the law of one, and perhaps many other lifetimes, but I truly admire the work you're doing. Your website is
apmagazine.info, I-N-F-O.
Okay, apmagazine.info?
Yeah.
Okay. And I've seen your website, and some fascinating articles and books can be ordered there, your own books as well as from Andrew Collins and others. We really look forward to meeting the two of you in Little Rock, Arkansas, which, by the way, is probably about 20 minutes away from Toltec Mounds State Park that you spoke about. I actually grew up in that area, so I've been there many, many times.
One other thing, you do an amazing job, too. What you put together is absolutely amazing. These seminars and weekend-long workshops you do are just amazing. And I have heard from people that have been to them, and they are just overwhelmed with all the information and the people that they get to meet. So I would encourage anybody out there listening or anybody that listens in the future, go to one of this man's workshops. It's incredible what you do.
Well, thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate that. I'm touched. Thank you. So thank you both very, very much. I'd like to encourage all the listeners to visit the Edgar Cayce website, which I believe is www.edgarcayce.org. We will be pushing a membership drive in Arkansas, and we do still have a few seats available. We've got over 500 signed up now, and we expect to sell out at 625. And so if you're interested in attending this event with Graham Hancock, Stanton Freeman, Dr. Lora Little, Dr. Greg Little, John Van Auken, David Childress, and 16 other speakers, we'd love to have you. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Greg and Lora.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.